Today I'll tell you the story of Flight 2801 and what happened on Svalbard after the 2154 crash in 1996. Because this was more than a disaster, it changed everything. On August 29, 1996, a routine flight headed toward one of the most remote places on Earth. It carried workers, families, and entire communities returning to the Arctic. For them, this journey was familiar, but within minutes of reaching its destination, something went terribly wrong. What followed would become the deadliest aviation disaster in Norwegian history, and forever change life on a frozen archipelago few people had ever heard of. The aircraft was approaching Svalbard, a remote group of islands in the Arctic Ocean. Here, far above the Arctic Circle, small settlements existed in isolation, shaped by cold, darkness, and industry. Life was harsh but tightly connected. Everyone knew each other, and many of those on board were not just passengers that they were the backbone of entire communities built around coal mining and survival in extreme conditions. As the plane descended toward the airport near Longyearbyen, visibility was limited. The surrounding terrain was unforgiving, steep mountains rising sharply from the icy ground. In this environment, even small navigational errors could have serious consequences. What should have been a routine landing instead turned into a tragic miscalculation. The aircraft veered off course and struck the side of a mountain known as Oprafjellet. There were no survivors. All 141 people on board lost their lives instantly. The impact site was high in the mountains, making rescue efforts extremely difficult. The Arctic conditions only added to the challenge. For Norway, it was the worst aviation disaster in its history. But for the small Russian mining communities nearby, it was something even more devastating. A collective loss that touched nearly every family. Many of the passengers were workers from Russian settlements on Svalbard. Among them were residents of Pyramiden, a Soviet-era mining town located deep in a fjord. It was a place unlike any other, a fully developed community in the Arctic, complete with schools, cultural centers, and apartments. Though isolated, it was vibrant, structured, and deeply connected. In a place like Pyramiden, losing dozens of people at once was not just a tragedy. It was a rupture in the fabric of daily life. Entire teams, families, and social circles disappeared overnight. There was no anonymity here. Every loss had a name, a face, a story, and suddenly the routines that once defined life in the Arctic began to feel empty. At that time, Pyramiden faced an uncertain future. After the Soviet Union fell, support began to drop, funding became limited, the number of people in the town was going down, long-term plans were no longer clear. Then the crash happened. After that, life began to change. People slowly lost the feeling that once kept the town united. Life went on, but it felt different. People came back to work, but the mood had changed. The daily routine became slower and more quiet. In a small town, every loss is felt. Empty homes became a constant reminder. Silence replaced what was once familiar. With time, fewer people felt ready to stay. The idea of a future there began to fade. At the same time, economic reality was catching up. The coal seam that sustained the town was becoming increasingly difficult to extract. Mining deeper into the earth required significant investment, and the cost of continuing operations in such a remote location was rising. The balance between effort and return was no longer sustainable. By 1998, a decision was made. The mine would close. With it, the town would be abandoned. For many, this decision came as a relief rather than a shock. The emotional toll of recent events combined with economic uncertainty made the idea of leaving feel inevitable. The Arctic had taken too much, and there was little left to hold on to. The final residents prepared to leave quickly. There was no gradual transition. Within days, people packed what they could and departed. Many belongings were left behind: furniture, books, personal items. It was as if the town had been paused rather than closed. Doors shut, but not locked. Life stopped, but not erased. Families returned to mainland Russia and Ukraine. There they faced a very different reality. The late 1990s were a difficult period economically. Jobs were scarce, especially for former miners and their families. The transition from a structured Arctic community to uncertain civilian life was not easy. And for many, the loss they carried was not just emotional, it was also deeply practical. In the aftermath of the crash, compensation became a complex issue. The airline offered payments to the families of victims, but many believed the compensation did not reflect the scale of the tragedy. They sought justice through legal action, hoping for a more substantial outcome under international frameworks. However, jurisdiction and legal boundaries complicated the process. Because the workers were employed under Russian operations on Norwegian territory, determining applicable laws was not straightforward. The case extended over several years. In the end, settlements were reached, though not always to the satisfaction of those affected. It was a reminder that even after tragedy, resolution is not always clear or complete. Meanwhile, life on Svalbard did not stop entirely. Another Russian settlement, Barentsburg, continued its operations. Coal mining persisted, supplying energy to parts of Europe. Though smaller than before, the community remained active. For the remaining residents, it became the last functioning outpost of a once larger presence in the Arctic. Pyramiden, however, was left behind. Without people, it transformed into something else entirely. Buildings remained intact, preserved by the cold, dry climate. Wood did not rot, metal aged slowly. Time seemed to move differently here. The town became a snapshot of a specific era, frozen in place. Over time, Pyramiden attracted a new kind of visitor. Tourists, researchers, and photographers began arriving, curious to see a Soviet-era town abandoned in the Arctic. Guided tours replaced daily routines. Empty apartments became exhibits. What was once a functioning community became a historical experience. Efforts were made to maintain parts of the town. Signs were repainted, buildings were stabilized, not to restore life, but to preserve the image of what once existed. It became both a museum and a symbol, and of ambition, isolation, and the limits of human presence in extreme environments. Nature slowly began to reclaim the space. Arctic winds moved through open structures. Seabirds nested in abandoned rooms. Snow-covered pathways that were once walked daily. Yet the town never fully disappeared. It remained visible, structured, almost waiting. High above the settlement on the slopes of Opera Fjellet, remnants of the aircraft still remain. The crash site is difficult to access and rarely visited. In the harsh Arctic conditions, debris has been preserved alongside the landscape. A memorial stands there, marking the location and honoring those who lost their lives. The memorial is simple but powerful. It includes a cross, inscriptions, and the names of all 141 victims. For those who cannot visit, it exists as a distant point in a vast and silent environment, a place where memory and landscape merge into something permanent. reaching the site is not easy. The terrain is steep and conditions can change rapidly. For most visitors, it remains out of reach. Instead, the story is told through photographs, accounts, and the preserved town below. The connection between the two remains clear, one event shaping the fate of an entire community. Today, Svalbard continues to exist as a unique region. Governed by international agreements, it hosts a mix of Norwegian and Russian presence. Barentsburg remains active, though smaller than in the past. Its future, like many Arctic settlements, depends on shifting economic and political conditions. Global demand for coal is changing. Energy transitions and environmental concerns are reshaping industries worldwide. In such a context, maintaining remote mining operations becomes increasingly difficult. Questions about sustainability and long-term viability continue to grow. Sanctions and geopolitical tensions also play a role. Operating in the Arctic requires coordination, resources, and stability. Any disruption can have immediate consequences for small communities. What remains today is not just a settlement, but a symbol of persistence in uncertain conditions. Across the Arctic, there are many abandoned towns. Some were built for mining, others for research or military purposes. Most share a similar story: rapid development followed by sudden decline. But Pyramiden stands out not because it was the largest, but because of how abruptly its story ended. It is rare to find a place where everything remains so intact. Classrooms, theaters, apartments, all preserved as they were. Walking through Pyramiden today feels less like exploring ruins and more like stepping into a paused moment in time. There is no single reason for its abandonment. Economic decline, political change, and natural challenges all played a role. But the crash of 1996 remains one of the defining moments, a turning point that accelerated what might otherwise have taken years. For those who once lived there, the memory is personal. It is not just about history or geography. It is about people, relationships, and lives that were suddenly interrupted. And while the town remains, the community that defined it exists only in memory. Visitors often describe a unique atmosphere in Pyramiden, not eerie but reflective, a sense that something important happened here, something that shaped the place in ways that are still visible. The statue of Lenin still stands, facing the fjord. It overlooks the landscape as it has for decades. Around it, silence dominates. Only wind and distant sounds of wildlife break the stillness. In summer, cruise ships bring visitors. Guides lead groups through the town explaining its history. Rooms once filled with life are now part of a narrative told to outsiders. The story continues to evolve. Each year brings new discussions about the future of Arctic settlements. Economic pressures, environmental concerns, and global politics all intersect here. Yet some things remain unchanged. The cold preserves, the landscape endures, and the traces of human presence remain visible long after people leave. The crash site, the town, and the memorial are all connected. Together they form a story about ambition, risk, and consequence. A story that is not widely known, but deeply significant. In places like Svalbard, history does not disappear quickly. It lingers in structures, in terrain, and in memory. Events from decades ago can still feel present. The Arctic has a way of preserving both physical and human stories. What happens here does not fade easily. And while the world moves forward, some places remain still. Not forgotten, but waiting to be remembered. Pyramiden is one of those places. a town without residents yet full of history, and high above it, on a quiet mountainside, a reminder remains of a single moment that changed everything.